Chapter 12. Run. Danny Ortiz peered down the hood of the Peterbilt 579 into the darkness ahead. He was driving north through the city of Fairfield Village along Clifford Street just east of Flint, Michigan. He wasn't a truck driver by trade. He'd been driving for hours and his shoulders hurt. Danny was on his way to pick up Flint refugees who'd eluded the barricades and escaped the city. A few miles up the road, where Interstate 475 and Highway 69 intersected, was a Michigan National Guard checkpoint. He was supposed to intercept the refugees in the vicinity of Clifford and 12th, just east of the 475 and south of the checkpoint. He didn't know how many there'd be, but he figured the 50-foot trailer he was hauling would accommodate whoever showed up. There was no moon, and he strained to see in the low light. Danny was associated with an ad hoc activist clique made up of techie and barista types from in and around the Austin, Texas area where he lived. They weren't a group who generally be described as revolutionaries. They were merely like-minded people who were connected through social media and flash meetings. It was at one of these impromptu gatherings that the group happened across a random post on a dark website. The message, posted by somebody calling themselves John Brown, told of a band of Flint escapees who were traveling along Thread Creek trying to put some distance between themselves and the city. Danny's group pooled their money to rent a truck, and Danny had volunteered to go get the refugees. It had been 2 months since martial law had been declared in Flint. Since then, the city had become a ghetto in the strictest Warsaw sense. Barbed wire and hedgehogs completely sealed off the city, and the perimeter was under constant patrol. No media of any kind was allowed beyond the barricades. Inside the city, all communications were cut. Cell phones and computers were impounded, and all personal identification was confiscated. A dusk to dawn curfew was in effect, and store shelves were empty. Government-issued rations were less than 300 calories a day, and municipal services were non-existent. The few brave journalists who initially covered the quarantine had been quickly and violently dispatched. If Danny were caught helping the escapees, he'd face their same fate. He thought about all the people who had ignored all the warning signs. Everybody saw what was happening, but nobody wanted to believe it. Not here. This was a government ruled by law, not men. It had been precisely this head-in-the-sand type of denial that had allowed the present cancer the time to spread. The total news blackout had worked. After a few news cycles that gave disproportionate national attention to random celebrity escapades or star athletes' numbers, the country forgot all about Flint. Anxious out-of-state relatives, concerned about loved ones, were given a number to call. Once connected, a recording instructing the caller to leave a message. That would be the end of it. The administration's original stated objective in occupying Flint was to restore order. The actual objective was to gain compliance through suppression and intimidation. Any suspicious behavior inside the ghetto resulted in immediate arrest. Hundreds of Flintonians were charged with sedition. Cases ranging from unlawful assembly to unauthorized dissemination of information were heard by military courts set up inside the ghetto. Tribunals appointed by Kellogg tried the cases. The 3-judge panels constituted the final word on all matters, and there were no appeals. The legality of the actions was challenged by a plethora of organizations, including the Civil Liberties Union, to no avail. The courts either upheld the government's position or delayed rulings that would have prohibited their going forward. To safeguard his personal security, the president relied on a reservoir of select shock troops known as the Order of the Guardian Keep. This private army was administered by specially trained, highly disciplined Jesuit monks who oversaw the most ruthless of recruits. The monks reported directly to Father Will Galore. It was the keepers, dressed in their immaculate white uniforms, trimmed in gold braid piping, who served as the gospel Gestapo. On Saturdays, out of public view, prisoners were brought into the Northwestern High School gym, where they heard the charges and pleaded their defense. No lawyers were allowed. On Sundays, convicted prisoners were bused to the Genesee Valley Center Mall, where sentences were carried out. With no witnesses present, the condemned were lined up along the brick wall at the mall entrance. At high noon, a nearby church bell would toll. At the sound of the last knell, the master keeper would step forward and announce, "And fire came forward from the presence of the Lord, and consumed them, and they died in the presence of the Lord." The corpses were later collected by garbage trucks. The few accounts of atrocities that made it out to the world were so inconceivably inhumane that no one believed them. The rendezvous point should be close then, he thought. He was sure to see something soon. Reaching for the gear shift, he flicked the splitter down and the 18-wheeler slid into the lower gears. As the 500 horsepower diesel downshifted, he sniffed under his arm. The tattered flannel shirt he wore was almost as pungent as the highway's ever-present roadkill. He was longing for a bath when a shadowy figure suddenly appeared on the side of the road. The absurdity of a Mexican smuggling blacks inside the USA still seemed ludicrous, but when additional shapes appeared, he hit the brakes. He eased the truck over to the shoulder and leapt out of the cab. Racing to open the trailer doors, he suddenly heard popping sounds. When he felt a buzz zip past his ear, he realized he was under fire. He didn't know who was shooting at him, but it didn't matter. He kept running. The side of the freeway embankment proved steeper than he'd realized, and he lost his footing. Tumbling headlong into a gully, he felt a series of dirt clods pop up around his head as bullets peppered the ground. Lying on his belly in the tall black medic weeds, he was afraid to move and afraid not to. The gunfire was coming from across Clifford Street and to the west, about 50 yards away. 200 feet to the north, he heard somebody yelling. He inched on his belly deeper into the weeds. It took all of his resolve not to get up and run. The sound of many boots rapidly clopping across Clifford Street froze him in place. It was the guard, all right. They must have been on routine patrol and lucked into the rendezvous. He held his breath as the shooting continued. Finally, the footsteps faded to the north. He didn't know if any of the escapees had been hit, but if they had been, they were keeping quiet about it. He remained stone still. He wasn't sure who might still be around. After an hour or so, he was about to move on when he heard a guard detail returning. He curled into a ball. He instantly regretted not running when he had the chance. But the guard only concerned themselves with the truck. Listening to the semi being chained up and hauled away, he knew they wouldn't find his prints inside the cab. He didn't care if they did, just so long as they didn't find him right now. Hours after the guard had gone, he still waited in place. He wouldn't raise his head until daylight. When the sun finally inched into the sky, he cautiously periscoped up from the weeds. No sign of the guard, but as depressing as it was, he knew the best bet was for him to stay put until it was dark again. He spent the day alternately napping and startling awake. He didn't have a clue as to what to do next. All he knew was the boots had gone north, so he was going south. Laying in the tall grass, staring up at the clouds, a bottle, carelessly tossed from a passing car, barely missed his face. When the sun finally set, he started walking. He figured it was about 30 miles to the next town. If he only walked at night, he'd get in about 18 miles in 6 hours of darkness. He walked in the ditches, following the road, ducking out of sight whenever headlights appeared, tripping over debris, stumbling through the ruts while trying to stay out of harm's way, made for slower going than he'd calculated. His filthy clothes and dark skin made it clear he wasn't a property owner around here. He didn't want to answer any questions, and the best way to do that was to stay out of sight. As daylight approached, a nearby bur oak tree looked like the safest place to spend the day. As he hoisted himself up into the cover of its branches, he heard his stomach gargle. He was so hungry, he felt hollow. From his vantage point in the tree, he could see a McDonald's in the distance. It might as well have been on the moon. After a few torturous hours, his leafy accommodations got the best of him. Finding comfort in an oak tree was equivalent to finding chitlins in a mosque. His legs kept falling asleep, and ants kept him constantly scratching. Before twilight had turned fully into night, he loosened the knot he tied in his shirt sleeve to keep him from falling in his sleep, and let himself down to the ground. Brushing himself off, he set out into the dusk. All he could think about was getting to a place where a dirty Mexican milling the streets was invisible. He got as far as Island Lake Recreational Area, a wooded reserve on the outskirts of Green Oaks Township. before it got light again. As the sun came up, he made his way off McCabe Road and into the forest. He felt like a vampire. By the time it got dark again, he was so hungry he almost didn't care if he got caught. Almost. Thank God for the reserve's litter bugs. After inhaling the few scraps he'd stumbled across at a deserted campsite, he'd headed southwest, looking to follow a major thoroughfare. The next dawn found him trudging along U.S. Highway 23. With blistered feet and a fatigue that bore testament to the journey, he discovered he was just north of Ann Arbor. He was relieved to see a Lowe's home improvement sign a half mile or so ahead. When he reached the center's parking lot, he'd found hopeful day laborers already gathered there. Danny sat down on the concrete parking stop next to a smaller group of men. The men weren't particularly friendly and greeted him with suspicion. Parking lot xenophobia, Danny thought, but he understood. Some of the men had families. Work was scarce and competition wasn't something they welcomed. You don't have to like me, he mused. I just want to blend in long enough to get back to Austin. He wondered what happened to the escapees. Did they make it? He hadn't seen or read anything in a couple of days. He wasn't sure if something like an escape would even be reported. He was staring at the trash at a half-eaten hot dog when a stubby man in new work boots handed him a paper plate wrapped in cellophane. A profuse gracias was all he could manage. Not waiting for the offered plastic fork, he fumbled frantically with the wrapping. Using his fingers to wolf down the rice and beans, he never noticed the band pulling into the house. Suddenly, somebody yelled,
Everybody, freeze.
Everybody freeze.